We have Olsi Jazashi, historian and social activist, joining us out of Kuala Lumpur to kick off the morning. Hello, Olsi. Good to have you. Good morning out to you out there in Kuala Lumpur. Your initial thoughts on what that day stood for, what the Islamic Revolution stood for, and the significance of the U.S. Embassy takeover.
Thank you for having me. The U.S. Embassy takeover by Iranian revolutionaries in 1979 was an event that shocked the world, and in particular, it showed to American imperialism the power of the Islamic Revolution. Iranian revolutionaries, they were uh, upset with what the Americans had done to their country. And as you mentioned, the enmity between the Americans and the Iranians had started since the coup of 1953, when the Americans installed the dictatorship of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi in Iran, and they helped the secret service of the Shah to crush Iranian democrats and their revolutionaries. Moreover, after the success of the Islamic Revolution, what the American administration did is they continued their support for the people of Pahlavi by even giving asylum to Mohammad Reza Pahlavi in the United States. So I mean, Iranian people, they were enraged by this behavior of the Americans, and they wanted, in a way, a prison exchange. The Iranian nation, they wanted to have Mohammad Reza Pahlavi back to Iran, where the dictator could stand trial for the crimes that he did. And in the revolutionary situation that we had in November 1979, as we know, a group of Iranian revolutionaries, they decided to take over the US embassy. Like the Americans before, they had intervened in the internal affairs of Iran. Iranian revolutionaries, they thought, okay, now is the time for us to intervene in the internal affairs of the United States. But of course, this takeover of the embassy, it shocked the Americans. And as we know, in this time, the Americans were in their full support of the Israeli regime and its apartheid against the Palestinians. And the Islamic Revolution of 1979 shocked and destroyed the geopolitical calculations of the Anglo-Americans and the Zionist Empire. We have to remember here that the Anglo-Zionist Empire, they took Palestine from the Ottomans in 1917, and in 1924, with the collaboration of the rulers of Turkey of that time, they killed the political institution of Sunni Islam, which was the Ottoman Caliphate. When Sharif Hussein of Mecca tried to renew the caliphate in the kingdom of Hijaz, the Americans, they used the Saudis the English, the British used the Saudis to invade Mecca and Medina and to destroy the political Islam of Sunni Islam, the political institution, which was the caliphate. But what happened in Iran in 1979, suddenly and unexpectedly, the political Islam made a comeback somewhere where the Americans, they never expected it, which was in Tehran. And with this comeback of political Islam in Tehran, the Americans and the Zionists, they saw that the new republic, which was established in Tehran, it was a republic which was committed to the liberation of Palestine. So the Americans, they could never forgive and forget the Iranians for what Imam Khomeini is going to do to them. And for this reason, they were using their embassy as a center of espionage, disinformation, propaganda, and destabilization of Iran. So faced with such situation, Iranian revolutionaries, they thought that there was no way but to take over the US embassy and to establish law and order in the country.
Right. Well, see, and on the same day of Aban 13th, back in 1964, about 15 years before the Islamic Revolution, Muhammad Reza Shah Pahlavi forced Imam Khomeini into exile, first to Turkey and then to Najaf in Iraq. And this was after he made a speech to seminaries in Qom, Iran. He voiced objection to the legal immunity that American agents were receiving on Iranian soil, some literally American and many inside the political and intelligence apparatus of the Pahlavi regime that were more dedicated to the Americans than to their own people. Historical documents in Iran's contemporary history show it was American CIA that had ordered Imam even to be exiled, OC. And at that time, Americans had tens of thousands of agents active in the country. Like I said, some American, many of them bought off Iranians. Imam Khomeini had objected that if low-ranking American agent insults or stomps on an Iranian prominent religious scholar in the country and commits whatever crime that he wishes, and these are his exact words, the Iranian legal system would remain totally neutral and no one would have a right to stop him. Now, also, this is not just the U.S. playbook in Iran, this interference, manipulation, and control. It's the collective West over the centuries, isn't it? And Iran has, since the revolution, stood against these exact dictates of the West, sometimes at great cost.
Yes, you're right. And I mean, by mentioning the exile of Imam Khomeini, you really pointed exactly to another important confrontation between the American Zionist imperialism against political Islam, and in particular against the power of the institution of the Vilayat al-Faqih. Imam Khomeini, who was a great visionary in his speeches and lectures, which were later published in the book Vilayat al-Faqih, he pointed out to the Iranian nation that the imperialists, the Americans, and the British, they want to distort and destroy Islam. But in his speeches, Imam Khomeini, he reminded the Iranian nation and the Islamic Ummah that Islam is a political religion. He reminded the Iranians that if we see the Sunnah of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or the history of our Imams, they fought against the Taghut. So the ideas of Imam Khomeini and his revolutionary ideology of the Vilayat al-Faqih worried the Americans a lot. I mean, because the Americans and the British before them and the French, they had destroyed the institution of the Sunni political Islam, which was the institution of the Caliphate. Moreover, the Americans and their Egyptian allies, they went against Muslim Brotherhood and the ideas of Sayyid Hassan al-Banna and Sayyid Qutb. But suddenly, in Iran, we'll have a new revolutionary, and he was Imam Khomeini. And his ideology of the Vilayat al-Faqih was very appealing. And in a way, the ideology of Imam Khomeini was the continuation of the long history of political Islam propagated from the time of Sultan Abdul Hamid II and Jamaluddin al-Afghani to Muhammad Abdu, Muhammad Rashid Rida, and to the Muslim Brotherhood founders Hassan al-Banna and Sayyid Qutb. But Imam Khomeini took this ideology, and Imam Khomeini, being a cleric, not being a secular person, like most leaders of political Islam in the Sunni world are, he became a very important and at the same time dangerous person for the global Zionist movement. Because the Zionists, they thought that by destroying the Ottoman Empire, by killing the Sunni Caliphate, by colonizing the Muslim world, and the year from 1973, the Yom Kippur War, to 1979, when the Americans will force the Egyptians to have a peace treaty with Israel, the Americans and the Zionists, they thought that suddenly we have defeated the Arabs, we have destroyed political Islam, and now the century of Pax Judaica is going to start, where the Zionists, they are going to triumph over the Muslims. But the unexpected happened. There was a miracle which was happening in Iran and in Tehran. Shia Islam, which historically had been oppressed by the Sunnis from the time of Imam Hussein to 1979, suddenly made a comeback. There was something that American spin doctors, Zionist spin doctors, they never thought that it will come. I mean, Shia Islam was perceived as a sleepy form of Islam. But suddenly, yes, we had a miracle in Tehran. We had a great scholar, a great intellectual like Imam Khomeini, whose appeal will not appeal only to the Shias, but his appeal will appeal even to the rest of the Muslim world. What we see today with the so-called axis of resistance, which Iran has built, or General Qasem Soleimani and Imam Khomeini before Khamenei have built, where we have this axis of resistance from Tehran to Beirut to Gaza, it is the result of the ideas of Imam Khomeini. And his ideas shake the Muslim world and have created a new reality. And the Anglo-Zionist empire today is in a total panic because they thought that they killed Islam in 1924 when they destroyed the Sunni Caliphate. They thought that they defeated the Arabs when they forced the Egyptians to sign a peace treaty with the Israelis. But what happened is that the work of Imam Khomeini, which will culminate with the Islamic Revolution of 1979 and the US Embassy takeover, changed all their calculations. And this was a miracle of political Islam.
And thank you, Olsi. I'll come right back to you. Let me just update our viewers. If you're just tuning in, these are live images from the Iranian capital, one of many cities in Iran that's celebrating the National Day of Struggle against global arrogance. This was a anniversary of the U.S. Embassy takeover back shortly after the victory of the Islamic Revolution of 1979 here in Iran, where students at the time embarked upon and took over the U.S. Embassy, known as the Den of Espionage. There from the U.S. took over that embassy, held on to some of the embassy staff for a little over a year, and then released them. But nevertheless, was a day to push back against the arrogance of the U.S., its interference and manipulation in Iran's political and intelligence apparatus under the Pahlavi regime for decades. Now, Olsi, where do you see today U.S. interference and manipulation, such as Taiwan, countries like that, where it's rampant, the U.S. political interference, its military interference, pushing Taipei every day closer toward confrontation with China?
Well, the Americans, they intervene anywhere in the world and wherever they have potential enemies, from Taiwan that you mentioned to sometimes manipulating the issues of minorities within China. They intervened before in Russia by manipulating the Muslims of Caucasus against Russia and so forth. I mean, the job of the American empire is to follow the Roman dictum divide. Hello? Their job is to follow the Roman dictum of divide et impera, divide and rule. So, like they intervene in the internal affairs of Iranians, like they intervene in the internal affairs of people in the Arab world, like what Americans want, they want takeover of countries. Me originally coming from Albania, a country who was staunchly anti-American. We in Albania, we didn't have a US embassy until 1991. Like the Iranians, after Second World War, we closed the US embassy, and our communist government during the era of the Soviet Union threw the Americans out of the country because the communists, they knew that the Americans were not there for having diplomatic relations, but they were for creating troubles and civil wars and regime change and what they do. But if we see what Americans did to the people of the ex-Soviet bloc, is that they have taken over their countries. I mean, if you see nowadays countries like Bulgaria, like Romania, like Albania, like Ukraine, wherever the Americans intervene, they're going to bring death, destruction, and poverty. The same they try to do against China, the same they try to do against Russia. But their greatest enemy for the time being, unfortunately, is Iran. And why is Iran? Because Iran threatens the very heart of the American empire, which is Zionism. The Zionist mega project and mega design for the Middle East is that the people of Middle East, they should be destroyed, they should be subjugated into slavery. The Zionists, they want to treat Muslims like the American colonists. They treated Aboriginal Indians when they invaded America, and they massacred the Aboriginals. Their plans would have succeeded if there was no Islamic revolution in Iran in 1979, and if Iranians would have had no courageous students like those students who took over the US embassy. And this was probably thanks to the wisdom of Ayatollah Khomeini, who he understood very well that the greatest enemy of humanity, and in particular to Iran and to Islam, was the United States. Imam Khomeini, he named and labeled the United States the great shaitan. And he was right. And if we see what the Americans are doing today to the Muslim world, how they are supporting the Israeli genocide, the massacre of innocent Palestinians, I think that the time proved that Imam Khomeini had really a great prophetic vision. He was a man who could see in time and space and understand the evil of the United States. For people like us who come from Eastern Europe, who we were not happy with the communist and Soviet regime, for us, we were very naive not to understand what the Americans were. At the time when Imam Khomeini came to power in Iran, in Soviet Union, you had people like Gorbachev, who he thought that the Americans are good. He underestimated them. And look what is happening today to Russia. Russia is suffering because of the mistakes of the Soviet leadership. But on the other hand, Imam Khomeini, he understood very well that the real enemy of humanity and of Islam in particular were the Americans. And that's why he labeled them the great shaitan. And Iranians, when they celebrate in Iranian cities the anniversary of their revolution, they until today repeat the slogans of Imam Khomeini that America is the great shaitan. And they even repeat their proverbial slogan, Merkbar America, death to America.
And also today, the U.S. adventurism we've seen over the last couple decades in Iraq, in Afghanistan, involvement in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, in the Ukraine conflict, and of course in the South Americas, but if we want to stick to the region of West Asia, what is the end game for the U.S.? So why does it exhaust so many resources, so much capital, aside from its support for the Zionist entity and the atrocities that that entity is carrying out? What is the overall agenda of the U.S. and why is it spend so much money, so many resources, has so many bases in West Asia? To what end and to what objective does it persevere so much to stay in the region, have a heavy dominating presence, and keep its hegemony in concrete in West Asia?
Well, the desire and the intention of the Americans with all these wars that they are doing is the final destruction of Islam and Muslims. I mean, if we see what the Americans did to the Muslim world after the fall of the Soviet Union, they established what President George Bush I, he mentioned in the American Congress on September 11, 1991. When the Americans, they launched their first war against Muslims, which was the war against Iraq, and they prevailed against Saddam Hussein. George Bush I, he went to the US Congress and he announced the establishment of a new world order. And from the first war against Iraq, we have seen the second war of 2003. We have seen the American invasion of Afghanistan, destruction of Syria, of Yemen, of Libya, of Lebanon, and all the Muslim world. So Americans, they have a project, and that is the project of the Zionist domination of the Muslim world. I mean, Americans, they don't have their own policy. I mean, American nation, they have no ideology. Americans, they are a nation of colonists who went and stole the land of the Aboriginal Indians, and they established their colony in the island